The teller's hands stopped moving. She'd been typing my account number into her computer, and now her fingers just hovered above the keyboard like she'd forgotten what they were for. Her eyes flicked up to mine, then back to the screen, then up again. "Sir," she said quietly, "could you wait here just a moment? I need to ask my manager about something." I felt my chest tighten. 61 years old. Just sacked after 23 years of building another man's company. And now the bank was about to tell me there was something wrong with the only money I had left in the world. My childhood savings account, $582, opened by my father in 1985 when I was 20 years old and starting my apprenticeship. I'd come to close it because I needed every cent I could find. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "Has the account been frozen? Closed?" No, nothing like that. "Please, just give me 1 minute, Mr. Whitcomb." She walked away from her counter and disappeared through a door behind the tellers. I stood there in the Commonwealth Bank branch on Murray Street in Perth, holding my closure form, staring at the carpet. The carpet was the same blue-gray color I remembered from when I was a boy, walking in here with my father, his big rough hand wrapped around mine. He'd been so proud that day. He'd worn his good shirt, the one he only put on for weddings and funerals. "This is your account, Harlan," he'd said to me. "Not mine. Yours. You put a bit in when you can, even if it's just $1. A man who saves is a man who's free." He died in 2009. My father. Cancer took him in 14 months. I never put in more than a few dollars here and there. Mostly forgot about the account altogether after I started working for Westmore Hospitality Group in 2003. By then I had a proper salary, a proper bank account, a proper life. The little blue passbook went into a drawer, and I didn't look at it for nearly 2 decades. The teller came back, and there was a man with her now. Tall, balding name badge that said Bernard, branch manager. "Mr. Whitcomb," he said, extending his hand. "Would you mind stepping into my office for a few minutes? There's something we need to discuss with you. It's nothing bad, but it's not something I can talk about at the counter." I followed him. My legs felt strange, like they belonged to somebody else. We sat down in a small, glass-walled office, and he placed a thin manila folder on the desk between us. "Mr. Whitcomb," he said carefully, "are you aware that this account has an automatic share purchase plan attached to it?" "A what?" "A share purchase plan. It's been active since the 8th of March, 1985. Whoever opened this account set it up so that $15 of every deposit, plus all dividends earned, would be automatically converted into shares of a particular company. The plan has been running continuously for 41 years. I stared at him. The words made no sense. I felt like he was speaking another language, like I was listening through water. "My father opened that account," I said. "He was a hotel chef. He didn't know about shares. He didn't know anything about the stock market." Bernard opened the folder. "Whoever set this up knew exactly what they were doing, Mr. Whitcomb. The plan was extraordinarily well designed. Now, I need to ask you to sit down properly, and I want you to take a breath before I show you this statement, because the figure is going to come as a shock." I was already sitting down. I gripped the edge of the desk. "What company?" I asked. "What shares?" He turned the page around so I could read it, and when I saw the name printed across the top of that statement, my vision went black at the edges, and I had to put my head between my knees. The shares were in Westmore Hospitality Group, the company that had sacked me 11 days earlier. To understand why I almost passed out in that bank, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to know about my father, Ezekiel Whitcomb, and what kind of man he was, and what was done to him in a kitchen in Fremantle in the spring of 1985. My father was born in 1942 inches, a small town outside Albany. on the south coast of Western Australia. He left school at 14 and went to work as a kitchen hand in a roadhouse on the Albany highway. He had no formal training. Everything he knew, he taught himself. With his hands and his tongue and his memory. By the time he was 30, he was the head chef at the Esplanade Hotel in Fremantle, and people drove from Perth on weekends just to eat his cooking. He had a way with seafood that I have never seen in another cook before or since. He would stand at the back door of the hotel at 5 in the morning when the boats came in, and he would touch the fish, smell them, look at their eyes. He'd send half of what the fishermen brought him straight back. The cooks under him hated this, because it meant they had less to work with. But he didn't care. He served what was good. He didn't serve what wasn't. In 1981, when I was 16, a man named Reginald Westmore came to eat at the Esplanade. Westmore was 38 years old, the son of a wealthy property developer in Perth, and he had decided he wanted to be in the restaurant business. He ate my father's pan-fried doofish 3 nights in a row. And on the 4th night, he asked to meet the chef. He told my father he was opening a restaurant in Cottesloe, a beachfront place, and he wanted my father to be the head chef and the menu designer. He offered him a salary of $42,000 a year, which in 1981 was very good money for a cook. He also offered him something my father had never been offered before: a creative partnership. He told my father that the menu would be his, that his name would be on the wall, that the food would be whatever he wanted it to be. My father took the job. He was 39 years old. He had a wife and a son to support, and he believed Reginald Westmore was a man of his word. The restaurant opened in February of 1982. It was called the Cottesloe Room. My father invented every dish on that menu: the crab bisque that became famous across the state, the marron with brown butter, the slow-roasted lamb shoulder with native pepperberry, the little tarts of macadamia and burnt honey that people still talk about. He worked 16-hour days for the first 2 years. He hired and trained every cook in that kitchen. He chose every supplier. He built that restaurant with his own 2 hands. By 1984, the Cottesloe Room was the most talked-about restaurant in Western Australia. There was a 6-week waiting list. The Premier ate there. Cricketers ate there. A magazine in Sydney called it the best restaurant west of Adelaide. Westmore opened a 2nd location in Subiaco that year and a 3rd in Mount Lawley in early 1985, and my father designed the menus for all of them and trained the kitchen staff. What my father got, in exchange, was the same $42,000 a year he'd started on. No raise, no share of the profits, no equity. When he asked, gently, in the autumn of 1984, whether there might be some recognition of what he'd built, Westmore put his arm around his shoulder and said, "Zeke, mate, the recognition is your name on the menu. People know who you are. That's worth more than money. We're family here." My father believed him. He was that kind of man. In April of 1985, Reginald Westmore brought a young chef into the Cottesloe Room. His name was Damien Crawley. He was 29 years old. He had trained in Melbourne, and Westmore announced he would be the new executive chef across all 3 restaurants. My father, he said, would be moved to a consulting role. The salary would remain the same, but my father would no longer be in charge of any kitchen. My father went home that night and cried at the kitchen table. I had never seen him cry before. I was 20 years old, working as an apprentice cook at a hotel in Mandurah. And I drove up to Perth that weekend, because my mother rang me. I sat with my father in the backyard, and he told me what had happened. 20 years of work, Harlan, he said. And he hands it to a boy. 3 weeks later, on the 8th of May 1985, my father was sacked outright. Westmore came into the kitchen during service and told him to take off his jacket and leave. The reason given was that my father had argued with Crawley about a sauce. My father had said the sauce was wrong. Crawley said it was a new recipe. My father said it had his name on it, and it wasn't right. Westmore took Crawley's side, and my father walked out of the building that had made Westmore rich, with nothing but the chef's whites on his back. He was 43 years old. I came home for 2 weeks to look after him. My mother, Marlene, was still working as a primary school teacher in Bayswater, and the family had no savings to speak of. We did, however, have one thing my father had been doing in secret since the day he'd started working for Westmore. He had been keeping every single document, every memo, every menu draft, every supplier contract, every photograph of every dish before it went out. He had 3 cardboard boxes full of paper in the garage, all of it dated, all of it filed. "What's all this for, Dad?" I asked him. "In case I ever need to prove what I did," he said. He didn't sue Westmore. A solicitor he spoke to told him it would cost more than he'd ever recover, and Westmore had better lawyers than he could ever afford. My father swallowed it. He went back to work, this time at a small fish restaurant in Fremantle, and he made a quieter living. He never spoke about Westmore in front of me again, but there was one other thing he did. And this is the thing I didn't know about until I was 61 years old and sitting in a branch manager's office in Perth. The 8th of March, 1985, exactly 2 months before he was sacked, my father went to the Commonwealth Bank in Albany on a Saturday morning. He opened a new savings account in my name with $500 of his own money. He attached an automatic share purchase plan to that account. The plan would take $15 from every deposit and use it to buy shares in Reginald Westmore's company, which had just listed on the secondary market that year through a small public offering to raise capital for the Mount Lawley expansion. My father did this 2 months before he was sacked. He had no way of knowing he was about to be sacked. Or did he? I have thought about this for years now, and I think he knew. I think he saw what Westmore was. I think he saw the way the man's eyes moved when he made promises, and I think my father, being the kind of careful, watchful man he was, had decided to plant a seed in case he was right. After my father was sacked, he didn't tell me about the account. He just kept making small deposits into it, every fortnight, $15 at a time, year after year. Sometimes more. When my mother got a small inheritance from her aunt in 1992, $4,000, she put $2,000 of it straight into the account. The dividends, all those years of dividends from a company that grew from 3 restaurants to 147 across Australia, were automatically reinvested. Every single one of them bought more shares. My father never told me. My mother never told me. They wanted me to find it on my own. They wanted me to find it when I needed it. Now let me tell you about my own life, because the cruel symmetry of it is the heart of this whole story. I finished my apprenticeship in 1986, and I worked in hotel kitchens around Western Australia for the next 16 years. I was a decent cook, but never a great one. I didn't have my father's hands. What I had, it turned out, was a head for organization. I was good at running a kitchen, scheduling staff, managing costs, dealing with suppliers. By 2002, I was the operations manager of a 4-hotel group in the Southwest. In early 2003, I got a phone call from a recruiter. A growing hospitality company in Perth was looking for a national operations director. The salary was very good. The career path was excellent. The company, the recruiter said, was Westmore Hospitality Group. I almost said no. I almost hung up the phone. But I went and spoke to my father about it first. He was 61 then, retired, living quietly in Margaret River with my mother. We sat on his back veranda, and I told him what I'd been offered. He was silent for a long time. He looked out at the bush and the kookaburras going at it in the gum trees. Finally, he said, "Take the job, son. Are you sure? Take it. Learn everything they have. Work harder than anyone else. Don't ever tell anyone you're my son." Westmore won't remember the name. He never remembered anyone's name. Just go in there and build it. build it bigger than he could ever build it himself. I asked him why. I didn't understand. Because one day, he said, "You're going to be glad you did." That was all he said. So I took the job. I started at Westmore Hospitality Group on the 3rd of February, 2003. I was 38 years old. Reginald Westmore was 60 by then, and he didn't remember meeting me when I was 16. Didn't remember my father's surname. Didn't remember any of it. He shook my hand on the first day and said, "Welcome aboard, Harland." He never even got my name right. For 23 years, he called me Harland instead of Harlan. I never corrected him. I worked harder for that company than any human being should ever work for any other human being. I was the one who designed the regional expansion strategy in 2007 that took us from 28 venues to 64 in 5 years. I was the one who built the central commissary in 2011 that cut food costs by 19%. I was the one who negotiated the supplier contracts after the financial crisis that kept the company solvent when half our competitors went under. I was the one who hired and trained the regional managers, who designed the staff retention programs, who flew to Adelaide and Brisbane and Hobart and Darwin to open new venues. I worked 60-hour weeks for 2 decades. My wife, Diane, raised our daughter Penelope mostly on her own. By 2026, Westmore Hospitality Group had 147 venues across Australia, 12,000 employees, and an annual turnover of just over $640 million. Reginald Westmore was 83 years old, still chairman, still on the board, still walking through the head office in West Perth like he'd built every brick of it himself. His son, Tobias Westmore, was the CEO. Tobias was 46. He had taken over from his father in 2021. He had an MBA from somewhere in America, and he wore very expensive suits, and he had never worked a single shift in any of his father's kitchens. In the autumn of this year, on the 17th of February, my mother died. She was 84. She had been ill for some time, but the end came faster than any of us expected. My father had passed back in 2009. So it was just me and my sister Beverly arranging the funeral. The service was scheduled for the 23rd of February in Margaret River, 3 hours drive south of Perth. I went to Tobias Westmore's office on the 20th of February to ask for the 4 days off. I had been at the company for 23 years. I had something like 140 days of unused leave on the books. Tobias didn't look up from his computer. "Harlan, mate, this is a really tight time for us. We've got the board presentation on the 24th. Could you do the funeral on the weekend?" "It's my mother's funeral," I said. "Yeah, no, I get that. I'm just saying, can someone else handle the arrangements? Your sister, maybe? You're a key man here, mate. We need you in that room." I stood there, and I looked at this man, this child of privilege with his shiny shoes and his white teeth. And I thought about my father at the kitchen table in 1985 with his face in his hands. And I said, "Tobias, I am attending my mother's funeral. I am taking 4 days. I am not asking permission." He looked up then. His face had changed. "Right," he said. "Right. Well, we'll speak when you get back." The funeral was on a Tuesday. It rained the way it rains in Margaret River in late February, soft and warm. We buried my mother next to my father in the small cemetery outside Cowarumup. I went home to Perth on the Saturday. On the Monday morning, the 2nd of March, I came into the office and there was a security guard standing at the door of my office. There was a cardboard box on my desk. Tobias Westmore was sitting in my chair. "Harland," he said. "Look, mate. We've had to make some hard calls. The company's restructuring, going in a new direction. We need younger leadership at the operations level. We're letting you go. After 23 years. It's not personal, mate. It's business. We're processing a redundancy package, 3 months' pay, and we'll need you to sign a non-disparagement clause before that's released. 3 months' pay. I was 61 years old. I had a mortgage with 11 years left on it. My wife had been recently diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and her medications cost us nearly $400 a month, even with the rebates. My daughter was finishing her PhD in Adelaide, and we'd been helping her with rent. I had a superannuation balance that was respectable but not enormous, because I'd refinanced the mortgage twice to pay for my mother's care home in her last years. I packed my office in 23 minutes. The security guard walked me to the lift. I didn't say goodbye to anybody. I drove home and sat in the kitchen, and I cried for the first time since my father had died. For 11 days, I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell Diane. I didn't tell Penelope. I didn't tell my sister. I got up every morning, and I drove to a coffee shop in Mount Hawthorne, and I sat there with my laptop, and I tried to look like a man who still had a job. I sent out my CV. I rang old contacts. Nobody had anything for a 61-year-old operations director with a non-compete clause. On the 12th day, I worked out that we had 8 weeks of mortgage payments left in the offset account, and after that, we would be in trouble. I needed to find money. I went through every drawer in the house looking for forgotten accounts, old bonds, anything. And in the bottom drawer of an old chest of drawers in the spare room, inside a yellowing envelope, I found my childhood savings passbook from the Commonwealth Bank in Albany. The last entry was from 2007. The balance was $582. Better than nothing, I thought. I drove down to the city to close it. That is how I came to be sitting in Bernard's office on the 22nd of March, 2026, looking at a statement that said, the account I had thought contained $582 actually contained, in shares of Westmore Hospitality Group, 411,817 shares. 411,000 shares. I asked Bernard, in a voice that didn't sound like my own, what those shares were worth. He turned the page. He showed me the figure. The shares, at that morning's closing price, were worth $8,346,000. I sat there for a very long time. Bernard got me a glass of water. He waited. He was a kind man. Finally, I asked him to print everything. The full transaction history, going back to 1985. Every deposit, every dividend, every share purchase, every reinvestment. He said it would take a few hours. I said I'd come back the next day. I went home, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I told Diane everything. She held my hand. We didn't speak for almost an hour. Then she said, "Your father knew, Harlan. He knew." The next day I picked up the documents. There were 173 pages. I read through them in a cafe, and I worked out, slowly, what my parents had done. The original $500. The $15 deposits every fortnight from May 1985 until my father's death in 2009. The $2,000 from my mother's inheritance. The $400 from her tax refund in 1996. The smaller amounts throughout my mother's life. Every pension day from 2009 until her stroke in 2023, $15, $20, $50, when she could manage it. And the dividends. The dividends from a company that had grown 20,000% over 41 years. Reinvested, every cent. My share of the company, calculated against the total shares on issue, came to 4.6%. There was something else in those documents. There was a name listed as the original beneficiary signatory on the share purchase plan. The name wasn't mine. The name was my father's, Ezekiel John Whitcomb. He had set the plan up with himself as guarantor and beneficiary until my 21st birthday, at which point ownership had transferred fully to me. He had signed the papers in his own hand on the 8th of March, 1985, 2 months before he was sacked. I drove home and I sat in the garage where my father's 3 cardboard boxes of evidence had been stored for 30 years. I had moved them from Margaret River after my mother died. I had been meaning to throw them out. Now, I opened them. 41 years of menus. 41 years of supplier invoices, recipe cards, food photographs, letters from Reginald Westmore in the early 1980s addressed to my father, calling him the genius of the Cottesloe Room, promising him the world. A draft contract from 1984, never signed, in which Westmore had offered my father a 5% equity stake and then had withdrawn the offer 2 weeks later on the advice of his lawyers. My father had kept all of it. I rang a solicitor that afternoon. Her name was Imogen Thackeray, and she'd been recommended to me by my brother-in-law. I told her what I had. She asked me to come in the next morning. I sat in Imogen's office for 4 hours. I showed her the boxes. I showed her the share statements. She looked at me over the top of her glasses, and she said, "Mr. Whitcomb, you have something far more valuable than 4.6% of a public company. You have the documentary history of how that company was built. You have the proof of the wage theft, the unpaid creative contribution, and the fraudulent representations made to your father. And you have a current shareholding that gives you legal standing to call an extraordinary general meeting." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," she said, "that you can stand in a room full of shareholders, with the press present, and you can tell the truth about what happened in 1985. I thought about that for a long moment. "Will it cost a lot?" I asked. "It will cost some money," she said, "but you can afford it." I called the EGM under Section 249 of the Corporations Act, which allows shareholders with at least 5% or, in cases where the Constitution permits, less to requisition a meeting. Westmore Hospitality's Constitution permitted a 4% threshold. I qualified by 0.6%. The meeting was scheduled for the 24th of April at the Hyatt in Perth. 140 institutional shareholders attended. 3 news outlets sent reporters because the requisition itself had become a story. A sacked operations director suddenly turning up as a major shareholder was unusual enough to make the business pages. I stood up at the lectern. I was 61 years old. I was wearing the only suit I owned, the one I'd worn at my mother's funeral. My hands were shaking. Tobias Westmore was sitting in the front row, his arms folded, his jaw tight. Reginald Westmore was in a wheelchair next to him, 83 years old. He didn't recognize me. I began to speak. I told them about my father. I told them about the Cottesloe Room. I told them about the menus he had created and the kitchens he had built. I held up the unsigned 1984 contract that promised him 5% of the company. I read out the letters in which Reginald Westmore had called him a genius. I described the day in May 1985 when he had been removed from his own kitchen and walked out of the building with nothing. I told them about the share purchase plan my father had set up 2 months before he was sacked. I told them what he had said to me when I asked him whether to take the job in 2003. I told them what I had built for the company over 23 years, and how it had ended on the 2nd of March, with a security guard at my office door, 11 days after my mother's funeral. The room was silent. I could hear the air conditioning. I didn't ask the meeting to remove Tobias. I didn't ask them to remove Reginald. I tabled 3 resolutions. The first was a formal acknowledgement, in the company's official history, of my father, Ezekiel Whitcomb, as the founding chef and original menu architect of Westmore Hospitality Group. The second was the establishment of a scholarship in his name, funded by the company at $50,000 per year, for apprentice chefs from regional Western Australia. The third was a review, by an independent committee, of the company's age discrimination practices over the past decade. The vote was held that afternoon. All 3 resolutions passed. The first 2 were unanimous. The third passed with 81% of votes cast. Reginald Westmore did not speak during the meeting. After the vote, he was wheeled out by his nurse. He did not look at me. Tobias Westmore approached me afterwards and offered his hand. I took it. I did not say anything. The independent review, which concluded 6 months later, found that 34 senior employees over the age of 55 had been terminated in the preceding 4 years, against a pattern that the reviewers described as consistent with systemic age bias. Tobias Westmore stepped down as CEO 3 weeks after the report was published. The board appointed an interim chief executive from outside the family. I sold 1/3 of my shares in November of last year. I kept the rest. The dividends pay our mortgage and Diane's medications and Penelope's last year of doctoral fees. And there is enough left over that we will not have to worry again. I bought a small farm outside Margaret River, near where my parents are buried, and I drive down there on weekends and I work the soil and I think about my father. I have thought, many times, about why my parents never told me. Why they let me work for that man for 23 years without ever revealing the secret in the drawer. I think the answer is the one my father gave me on the veranda in 2003, even though he didn't say the words then. He wanted me to learn. He wanted me to build something. He wanted me to know, in my own bones, what those people were like, so that when the moment came, I would understand exactly what I had been given and exactly what to do with it. A man who saves is a man who's free. That's what he told me when I was 20 years old, in the Commonwealth Bank in Albany, his big rough hand wrapped around mine. He didn't just mean money, he meant evidence. He meant patience. He meant the long, quiet work of preparing for a day you hope will never come. If I could leave you with anything from this story, it would be these few things. Because I have lived them, and I know they are true. Loyalty given to people who do not deserve it is not loyalty. It is a habit. And habits can cost you your life. The people who love you most are often working for you in ways you cannot see. Keep your records. Keep every menu, every contract, every letter, every photograph of everything you have made with your own 2 hands. Save when you can, even if it is $15 at a time, because compounding does not care how small you start. And never, never let anybody tell you that you are too old to matter. The men who say that to you are usually the ones who are about to learn what your father knew all along. My name is Harlan Whitcomb. I am 61 years old. I built another man's empire for 23 years, and he sacked me at 61. And he did not know what my father had done in the autumn of 1985. The name on the building says Westmore, but the name on a great many of the shares now says Whitcomb, and it will say Whitcomb for as long as my daughter and her children, and her children's children, choose to keep it there. That is what my father gave me. That is what I am giving them.